I didn't grow up believing I'd be special. That wasn't the promise they gave me. The promise was simpler than that, and somehow heavier. If you do what you're supposed to do, they said, you'll be fine. Not rich. Not famous. Just fine. Stable. Secure. Safe. And for most of my life, I believed them. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't reckless. I didn't chase shortcuts or miracles. I followed instructions the way people follow road signs, trusting that someone smarter had already mapped the way. School first. Then college. Then a job with benefits. Then time. Time was always the missing piece. Give it time, they said. It'll pay off. I believed that too. In high school, I did what responsible kids did. I showed up. I paid attention. I didn't cause problems. When teachers said, "This will matter later," I took notes like it was a contract. College counselors talked about paths. Not passions. Paths. This degree is practical. That one has stability. This field is safe. Safe became my favorite word. I didn't love what I studied, but I respected it. I told myself love was optional, security wasn't. I watched classmates chase dreams and told myself I was being smarter. They'll figure it out later, I thought. I'm doing this the right way. My parents were proud of me. Not loudly, not emotionally, but in that quiet, relieved way that said, "Good. He's not going to struggle." That mattered to me more than I admitted. I graduated without drama. No gap year. No soul searching. Straight into the workforce. Entry-level position at a company everyone recognized. Health insurance. Retirement plan. A future that made sense on paper. When I told people where I worked, they nodded. "That's solid," they said. "You're set." Set. I held on to that word like proof. The first few years were exactly what they promised. I wasn't thriving, but I wasn't worried either. I paid my bills. I moved into a better apartment. I bought furniture instead of scavenging it. Every performance review ended the same way. "You're doing great," my manager said. "Just keep doing what you're doing." So I did. I stayed late. I said yes. I learned systems no one wanted to touch. I became reliable. Reliable is another word people love, because it usually means you'll carry more than your share. Raises came, but slowly. Promotions too, eventually. Each one just enough to keep me convinced I was moving forward, even when it felt more like standing on an escalator that had stopped working. Still, I didn't complain. Complaining was for people who hadn't followed the plan. I had. That was the difference. At least, that's what I told myself. The first crack appeared quietly. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't even a bad day. It was a conversation. I ran into someone I'd gone to school with, someone I remembered clearly because we'd taken the same classes, sat in the same lectures, stressed over the same exams. He'd barely passed. Skipped classes? Changed majors twice. I remember thinking back then, this guy's going to struggle. Now he was standing in front of me, relaxed, confident, talking about a job that paid more than mine, doing something I didn't even fully understand. "How'd you end up there?" I asked. He shrugged. "I just tried a few things. None of them worked at first." I laughed. "Must have been stressful." "Yeah," he said. "But it beats staying stuck." Stuck. That word followed me home. I told myself it was just one example. Anecdotes weren't data. Everyone's path was different. Still, I started noticing things. People younger than me moving faster. Friends with less experience earning more. Colleagues leaving and somehow landing better positions elsewhere. I didn't feel angry. I felt confused. Because I was doing everything I was supposed to do. Working hard. Being patient. Trusting the process. Wasn't that the deal? I doubled down. More responsibility. More loyalty. More patience. I told myself I was investing in long-term stability. That short-term gains were tempting but risky. This was the adult way, right? Then came the meeting. No warning. No build-up. Just a calendar invite with a vague title and too many people CC'd. The company was restructuring, adapting to market conditions, refocusing priorities. The language was smooth, polished, almost comforting. My position wasn't eliminated, just redefined. Same workload, different title, no raise. Opportunities are coming, they said. This is just temporary. Temporary. I nodded. I always nodded. That night, I opened my laptop and did something I hadn't done seriously in years. I looked at job listings. Not out of desperation. Out of curiosity. I expected to see roles like mine. Similar pay. Similar expectations. What I found instead made my stomach tighten. Jobs asking for my experience, paying less. Roles paying more, requiring skills no one had ever told me mattered. Entire industries I'd never even been encouraged to consider. It felt like opening a map and realizing the roads you'd been driving had quietly been rerouted, and no one bothered to put up signs. I closed the laptop. Overreacting, I told myself. Everyone feels behind sometimes. That's when I noticed something else. The people telling me to be patient were all ahead. Managers. Older relatives. Advisors who'd bought houses when prices made sense. People whose version of waited out had been rewarded because the system still worked when they'd waited. They weren't lying to me. They just weren't living in the same reality anymore. I didn't realize that yet. Not fully. But the unease was there. A low hum under everything. Like standing on ground that felt solid, until you noticed the cracks spreading quietly beneath your feet. The breaking point didn't come with a disaster. It came with a spreadsheet. Late one night, I ran the numbers. Income. Expenses. Savings. The future I was supposedly building. I did the math I'd been avoiding. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. I wasn't falling behind suddenly. I'd been falling behind slowly, so slowly I'd mistaken it for stability. The plan wasn't failing loudly. It was failing politely. And as I stared at the numbers, one thought settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable. If this is what doing everything right looks like, what happens to the people who can't afford to keep doing it? That's when I realized something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Following the path wasn't protecting me. It was keeping me in place. And the worst part? Everyone around me still thought I was doing great. At first, I told myself nothing had changed. That's how it always starts. You don't wake up one morning and decide the rules are broken. You assume you missed something. That there's a step you skipped, an effort you didn't make hard enough. So I worked harder. I didn't complain when responsibilities quietly doubled. I didn't question why projects kept landing on my desk instead of people with higher titles. I told myself this was how trust was built. They rely on you, my manager said once, smiling. It sounded like praise. It wasn't. I started arriving earlier, leaving later, answering emails I wasn't paid to answer, fixing problems that weren't technically mine. Not because anyone forced me. Because that's what people like me do when something stops adding up. We assume the answer is more effort. Months passed. Nothing moved. Not my salary. Not my title. Not my leverage. Just the expectations. I began noticing patterns I couldn't unsee. The loudest people advanced faster. The most agreeable people stayed put. The ones who jumped jobs every year somehow kept landing higher. That last one bothered me the most. I'd been taught loyalty was currency. That staying put meant stability. That companies rewarded patience. But the people who left weren't punished. They were rewarded. I told myself they were lucky. Or reckless. Or exaggerating their resumes. Anything except right. Then one afternoon, during a team meeting, something small happened. A younger colleague presented an idea. Nothing groundbreaking. Just confident. Polished. After the meeting, our manager pulled him aside. "I see leadership potential in you," she said. I stood there, pretending to pack my bag, listening. Leadership potential. I'd trained that colleague. I didn't feel angry. I felt invisible. That night, I went home and did something I hadn't done before. I compared timelines. Not just salaries, lives. Same age. Same education. Different outcomes. The differences weren't about intelligence or effort. They were about timing. Who entered which industry when? Who bought before prices exploded? Who graduated before requirements shifted? I realized something unsettling. The advice I'd followed wasn't wrong when it was given. It was just outdated. No one had updated the instructions, because the people giving them didn't need to. They were already through the gate. I started asking careful questions. Not confrontational ones. Quiet ones. What does advancement really look like here? What skills matter now? What would you do if you were starting over? The answers were always vague. Just keep at it. Be patient. Your time will come. Time again. Time was the one thing I was running out of. Not biologically. Strategically. Every year I stayed where I was, I became more specialized in systems no one outside my company cared about. My resume was filling up with experience that sounded impressive, until you realized it only mattered in one very specific building. I was becoming valuable in a shrinking context. That realization terrified me. So I tried to adapt carefully. Online courses at night. Certifications. Skills I was told would future-proof me. I added them to my resume. Nothing happened. I applied to a few roles elsewhere. Not recklessly. Just enough to test the waters. The rejections came fast. Overqualified. Underqualified. Not the right fit. All polite ways of saying, you don't belong where you are, and you don't belong here either. I wasn't behind because I was lazy. I was behind because I was optimized for a world that no longer existed. And the people who could have told me that didn't. Not maliciously. They just kept repeating what had worked for them. One night, scrolling through social media, something I rarely did seriously, I noticed something else. The success stories everyone celebrated followed a different script. They weren't about loyalty. They weren't about patience. They were about leverage. Switching jobs. Negotiating aggressively. Taking risks early, when failure was cheaper. No one had ever framed it that way for me. Risk had always been presented as irresponsibility. Stability as virtue. But stability, I was learning, had become expensive. And the cost wasn't obvious up front. It was paid quietly, over years. In missed opportunities. In delayed growth. In the slow erosion of options. I felt it physically. A tightness in my chest every Sunday night. A dull exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. A growing resentment toward advice that once comforted me. The worst part? I couldn't talk about it without sounding ungrateful. From the outside, my life looked fine. Job. Apartment. Health insurance. What right did I have to feel behind? So I stayed quiet. And that silence became another form of effort, one that drained me faster than the work itself. The breaking moment didn't come at work. It came at a family dinner. Someone asked how I was doing. Great, I said automatically. And for the first time, I realized I didn't believe it. Later that night, alone, I opened my laptop again. I didn't look at job listings. I looked at timelines. I calculated what would happen if nothing changed. 5 years. 10. The numbers were clear. If I stayed on this path, I wouldn't collapse. I would plateau. Quietly. Respectably. Forever. That's when the thought I'd been avoiding finally took shape. What if the problem wasn't that I wasn't trying hard enough? What if the problem was that I was still trying to win a game that had already ended? The idea scared me. Because if that was true, then staying wasn't safe anymore. It was risky. And walking away, the thing I'd been taught to fear, might be the only move that actually made sense. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall. For the first time in my life, I didn't know what the responsible choice was. And that uncertainty, that loss of a clear instruction, felt more dangerous than any failure I'd ever imagined. The scariest part wasn't that I felt behind. It was realizing I couldn't point to a single moment when it happened. There was no announcement, no warning, no email saying, "Hey, by the way, the rules you're following don't apply anymore." Life just moved. And I stayed where I was, still playing by instructions that no longer mattered. Once I started looking for it, I saw it everywhere. Not in headlines. Not in speeches. In conversations. In pauses. In what people didn't say anymore. I noticed how advice had changed tone. It used to be confident. Direct. Certain. Get a degree. Work hard. Stay loyal. Now it was vague. Be flexible. Stay competitive. Pivot. No one explained what that meant. Because the people who'd already pivoted didn't need explanations. And the people who hadn't were too busy surviving to teach anyone else. I started tracing it backward, like a detective working a cold case. I looked at when my parents bought their first home. When my managers entered the workforce. When mentors locked in careers that still rewarded patience. Their stories shared one thing: timing. They'd entered a system that still converted effort into progress. I entered one that converted effort into endurance. The difference was subtle, but brutal. I began to understand why the advice I'd followed felt sincere and useless. It wasn't designed to help someone start anymore. It was designed to help someone protect what they already had. That realization hit hardest when I noticed who benefited from stability. Companies. Institutions. People already ahead. Stability meant they didn't have to change. I did. But no one had told me that explicitly. So I stayed. I kept thinking one more year would make the difference. One more project. One more certification. One more performance review. Each one added weight, not momentum. It was like carrying bricks up a hill that no longer led anywhere. I remember the exact moment it clicked. I was sitting at my desk, updating a report no one would read twice. My inbox filled with messages marked urgent, that somehow never resulted in anything changing. I glanced at the calendar. 5 years. 5 years since I'd started this job. I pulled up the email from my first day. The excitement. The optimism. The belief that I'd arrived at the beginning of something. Then I looked at my current role. Same building. Same systems. More responsibility. Marginally more pay. I hadn't moved forward. The finish line had moved away. That's when I realized something else. The people who benefited from the old rules never noticed when they stopped working, because they were already insulated from the consequences. They didn't mean to mislead anyone. They just kept repeating what had once saved them. And when it stopped working, they assumed the problem was the person, not the plan. That's why the advice never changed. It didn't need to. It still served them. I tested this theory quietly. I stopped asking how to succeed and started asking when. When did you start? When did you buy? When did you move up? The answers told the story better than any statistic. Right after college. Before prices went crazy. Back when companies still trained people. Timing. Always timing. I wasn't late because I was lazy. I was late because no one told me the door had already closed. I noticed something else, too. The people who succeeded now didn't follow the old advice. They didn't wait. They didn't stay. They didn't optimize for loyalty. They optimized for optionality. They moved quickly. They failed fast. They treated jobs like stepping stones, not identities. And here was the part no one liked to admit. They weren't necessarily smarter. They were just allowed to make mistakes earlier, when mistakes were survivable. I'd been taught to avoid mistakes entirely. So I avoided movement. I started to feel anger then. Not explosive anger, something quieter, heavier. Not at any single person. At the silence. At how politely the rules had changed. At how many people were still being told to be patient, while patience slowly erased their leverage. At how easy it was to fall behind without ever doing anything wrong. One night, I sat alone and imagined two versions of myself. One who kept going exactly as I was. One who stopped and did something else. The first version didn't fail. That was the problem. He survived. He paid bills. He aged into the role. He became the person who told others, "Just give it time." The second version scared me. Because I couldn't see him clearly. He might struggle. He might look foolish. He might have to explain himself to people who wouldn't understand. But he would at least be moving. And movement, I was starting to realize, mattered more than correctness. That thought felt dangerous. I'd been trained to believe stability was safety. But stability, I now saw, was only safe if the ground underneath it stayed still. And the ground hadn't been still for a long time. The hardest part wasn't deciding what to do. It was admitting that the advice I'd trusted had expired. That meant something else, too. If the rules had changed quietly, then following them faithfully wasn't virtuous. It was naive. And that was a painful thing to accept about myself. I didn't like the idea that my discipline had worked against me. That my patience had been harvested by a system that no longer rewarded it. That my sense of responsibility had been used as an anchor. I wanted someone to blame. But there wasn't anyone. Just a gap between generations. Between timing. Between maps. The realization settled slowly, like a truth that doesn't ask permission. I wasn't broken. The instructions were. And the longer I followed them, the further behind I'd fall, not because I was failing, but because I was staying loyal to a version of the world that no longer existed. That's when a more frightening question appeared. If staying was no longer safe, what did leaving actually mean? Because walking away didn't just mean changing jobs. It meant stepping into a world with no clear rules. No guarantees. No one telling me I was doing the right thing. And for the first time in my life, that terrified me more than being stuck. I didn't quit right away. That's the version people expect, the dramatic one. The resignation letter. The leap. The clean break. That wasn't me. I stalled. Because once you realize the rules are broken, there's a moment where you still hope they'll snap back into place if you wait long enough. I kept telling myself I just needed clarity. A sign. A guarantee. Someone older and wiser to say, "Yes. Now is the right time." No one did. Instead, the advice shifted again. Be grateful. Things could be worse. At least you're stable. Stable had turned into a warning disguised as comfort. Every morning, I felt it more clearly, the quiet tax of staying. It wasn't burnout. It wasn't exhaustion. It was something colder. The sense that every day I stayed, I was narrowing my future without noticing. I started measuring time differently. Not in years. In options. Each project I took on made me better at something fewer people needed. Each promotion tied me more tightly to systems I couldn't carry with me. Each responsible decision made leaving more expensive. That's when the fear changed shape. At first, I was afraid of failing. Now I was afraid of succeeding, in the wrong direction. I watched people around me double down. New titles. Bigger teams. Longer meetings. They looked busy. Important. Needed. But when I listened closely, their language was defensive. After all these years, I've put too much into this to leave now. I can't start over. They weren't confident. They were trapped. That realization scared me more than instability ever had. One night, after a long day that produced nothing measurable, I stayed late in the office alone. The building was quiet. Lights dimmed automatically to save money. I opened my laptop and wrote 2 lists. One called Reasons to Stay. The other called Reasons I'm Afraid to Leave. The first list was short. Paycheck. Insurance. Familiarity. The second list was long. Judgment. Disappointment. Loss of identity. Explaining myself. Admitting the plan didn't work. That was the moment I understood something brutal. I wasn't staying because it was right. I was staying because it was defensible. If I stayed, no one could accuse me of being reckless. If I stayed, no one could say I'd given up. If I stayed, I could always say, I did what I was supposed to do. Leaving meant owning the outcome, whatever it was. And ownership is terrifying when you've been trained to follow instructions your whole life. I started noticing how often I used the word should. I should be grateful. I should be patient. I should feel satisfied. None of those sentences came from me. They were echoes. Voices of parents, teachers, managers, all well-meaning, all outdated. I began pulling back quietly. Not dramatically. Not rebelliously. I stopped volunteering for extra work. I stopped pretending I was excited about future opportunities. I stopped absorbing blame for systems I didn't design. It felt wrong at first. Like cheating. Like betraying a contract I'd never signed but had always obeyed. Then something unexpected happened. Nothing broke. The company didn't collapse. My team didn't fall apart. No one noticed. That's when it hit me. All that effort. All that loyalty. It had never been essential. I had been replaceable the whole time, just slowly enough that I hadn't felt it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me free. Because if I was replaceable there, then I was allowed to replace them too. Still, the final decision didn't come from courage. It came from exhaustion. One morning, sitting in traffic, I felt something close to panic, not because of stress, but because I could see my future too clearly. Same drive. Same conversations. Same reassurances. 10 years later, telling someone younger to just give it time. I pulled over. Sat there longer than necessary. And admitted the truth I'd been avoiding. Staying wasn't the safe option anymore. It was the riskiest one. Because staying guaranteed one thing. That I would never find out what else I could have been. I didn't quit that day. But that was the day I stopped belonging. From that point on, every task felt temporary. Every meeting felt like observation, not participation. I started preparing quietly. Not a grand reinvention. Not a fantasy escape. Just leverage. Skills that traveled. Connections that didn't depend on my title. Savings meant for time, not comfort. I stopped asking for permission, because I finally understood no one was going to give it. The scariest part wasn't uncertainty. It was how calm I felt once I accepted it. That calm scared me enough to know I was ready. Because the version of me who needed guarantees? He couldn't survive in this world anyway. And as I packed up my desk one evening, long after everyone else had left, I realized something else. Leaving wasn't the rebellion. Staying had been. Staying loyal to a system that no longer existed. I didn't know exactly where I was going. But for the first time, I knew what I wasn't willing to do anymore. And that was enough. I didn't leave with applause. There was no dramatic exit. No speeches. No moment where anyone suddenly understood. I finished my last week quietly. Returned my badge. Shut down my email. Walked out carrying a box that looked lighter than it felt. On the outside, it probably looked like failure. On the inside, it felt like honesty. The days after were strange. Too quiet. Too open. I woke up without an immediate direction and felt the reflexive guilt rise in my chest. The voice that said I was wasting time, falling behind, doing something irresponsible. That voice didn't disappear overnight. It had been trained into me. So I let it talk. I didn't fight it. I just listened. And the more I listened, the more I realized something important. That voice didn't belong to me. It belonged to the plan. The plan that promised safety if I behaved correctly. The plan that equated obedience with progress. The plan that stopped working, and then blamed the people who kept following it. I hadn't failed the system. The system had quietly moved on without telling me. That distinction mattered more than anything else. Because for the first time, I stopped asking the wrong question. I stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "Who gave me this map?" The answer wasn't sinister. It wasn't evil. It was outdated. I was handed instructions written for a different economy, a different timeline, a different risk profile. They weren't lies, they were relics. And I had mistaken loyalty to them for virtue. The weeks turned into months. Not all of them were easy. There were moments of doubt. Moments when I missed the certainty of a paycheck that arrived on schedule, even if it arrived attached to a ceiling. But something else happened too. My decisions started to feel like mine. Not defensible. Not impressive. Just deliberate. I didn't suddenly become successful in a way people like to post about. No overnight transformation. No tidy arc. What changed was quieter and deeper. I stopped comparing myself to timelines that were never designed for me. I stopped measuring progress by approval. I stopped treating stability like a moral obligation. And slowly, something I hadn't felt in years returned. Momentum. Not the kind that looks good from the outside, the kind that moves with you instead of against you. I talked to people without asking what I should do. I asked what they'd actually done, and when. I paid attention to timing, to leverage, to optionality. I learned that being behind is often just another word for being early to the wrong instructions. And that reframed everything. I wasn't late to life. I was early to realizing the rules had changed. That realization didn't make me special. It made me free. I could finally forgive myself for not arriving where I'd been told I would. Because arrival implies a destination that still exists. And the truth is, the destination had moved while I was walking toward it carefully, responsibly, obediently. I think about the version of me who stayed. The one who would have been fine, but never satisfied. The one who would have survived comfortably while quietly teaching others the same outdated advice. I don't judge him. He did what he knew. But I don't want to become him. Now, when people ask how I'm doing, I don't say, "Great," automatically. I say, "I'm figuring it out." And I mean it. Because figuring it out means I'm not pretending anymore. I'm not behind. I was just following a map that no longer matched the terrain. And once I stopped blaming myself for that, everything else became possible, not guaranteed, not easy, but honest. That's the part no one tells you. The real cost of doing everything you're supposed to do isn't failure. It's believing the gap between effort and outcome is your fault, when it never was. Letting go of that belief doesn't fix everything. But it fixes the most important thing. It gives you your life back.